that enriched uranium is for leverage. You have to have leverage at the negotiating table if you're going to force the Americans to stop killing people, to stop preventing Iran from importing medicine, importing food, making it more difficult to purchase the needs of ordinary people, making it more difficult for people to live a normal life in the country. So 60% has always been on the table. The Iranians have always been prepared to get rid of it in return for something else.
So our media right now, certain elements of our media and certain elements of what I would call the influencers are working very, very, very hard to give everyone amnesia about how many times it was claimed that Iran was about to develop a nuclear weapon. So I just want to take a quick look at a timeline of Netanyahu claiming that Iran was on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon and get your reaction.
If not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months.
They have the wherewithal, the stored up, preserved knowledge to make a bomb very quickly if they wanted to do it.
Iran is so dangerous. Weeks away from having the fissile material for an entire arsenal of nuclear bombs.
They're very close. They're 6 months away from being about 90% of having the enriched uranium for an atom bomb.
Iran is gearing up to produce 25 bombs, atomic bombs a year, 250 bombs in a decade.
Ladies and gentlemen, time is running out.
Iran will be capable of producing alone, without importing anything, nuclear bombs within 3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years, back in 1995. What is the truth of Iran's nuclear program? Why has Benjamin Netanyahu in particular been so insistent across literally decades that Iran is about to get a nuclear weapon? And what is the reality? We just saw on Fox News they claimed they uncovered a whole hidden site of a nuclear program nobody knew about. What's the truth?
Well, actually, that was very impressive. I did a deep seek search a couple of days ago, and the first time he said it, it's deep. Of course, sometimes these AI they get it wrong, but it said 1992. He said 3 to 5 years. So it may even go before that. But again, we know at least it's 1995, which is 30 years ago. But that's really the entire story. The whole thing has always been fabricated. The Iranians had a nuclear program before the revolution, and they were supposed to make 20 nuclear reactors, and Western companies were going to do it. And then when the revolution happened, they left, and they prevented Iran from, through sanctions and so on, they prevented Iran from continuing the program. And Iran had trained people. People go to university. They study in these fields. That there was a large investment. Of course, under the Shah, that investment was basically money going back in the hands of the Europeans and the Americans, not like creating an indigenous capability, which makes you vulnerable. So whenever they pull the plug, you no longer have nuclear energy. Or anything else. If you're buying an automobile and you can't repair it, if it breaks down, you no longer have an automobile. Right. So, and since the Americans were illegally and the Europeans illegally preventing Iran from developing its nuclear program, Iran had to secretly do so. What the Americans and the Europeans were doing was illegal according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, but they dominate that agency. So Iran had to secretly develop its peaceful nuclear program to, without the Americans finding out. Because back then, like they got help from the Chinese, for example, but back then China was still weak. So they were very careful not to anger the Americans. But so according to the International Atomic Energy Agency regulations, countries that have nuclear power are supposed to help countries that don't have it. So Iran began to develop its nuclear program, but also it began to develop the fuel cycle. Why? First of all, Iran had invested in a company in France that does uranium enrichment, but they would not give Iran any technical know-how, and they ultimately expelled Iran from the company. I think Iran held 10%. And so the Iranians said, well, we have to make our own nuclear fuel, or at least we have to be able to do so. Why? Because if we have these nuclear reactors tomorrow, and we don't know how to produce our own fuel, then they can pull the plug. And nuclear reactors are very expensive. Nuclear energy is cheap. So the investment is very great. And then later, after they're complete, it becomes inexpensive. So it's a huge investment. And so what if Iran produces these nuclear power plants? Its electrical grid is dependent on them. The desalination plants are dependent on them. And then suddenly the Americans, as they do sanction us, say, no more nuclear fuel for Iran. That would create an economic crisis. So right. Iran said we have to have the fuel cycle. And there's an example of this. Iran has an experimental reactor in Tehran, which probably the Americans will try to bomb, because we're very close to war. But in any case, the Americans apparently have pulled their planes out of Qatar and their ships out of the ports in Bahrain, and probably moving them out of range. And they say they've been taken to Saudi Arabia. And by the way, that makes all these countries complicit. And if there is war, they're going to pay the price. But in any case, the Iranians said that the Iranians produce medical isotopes. And I think Max actually went to that the Tehran experimental reactor, and he may have explained it to you, I don't know. But they produce medical isotopes for hundreds of thousands of cancer patients. And they do all sorts of other things for medicine, for industry, for agriculture, and all that, which I don't know much about. But in any case, that reactor used to use enriched uranium at, I think, well over 90%. 95, well, I think 97, 98, 99%. People can look it up on DeepSeek or whatever. So, but later they changed it so that it would use enriched uranium at 20%. Iran's fuel, more than a decade ago, at that reactor was running out. And the Americans refused to allow Iran to have new fuel. In other words, the Americans were using this as a tool to put pressure on Iran, putting cancer patients at risk of death so that they can force Iran to bend the knee. And so what did Iran do? It enriched uranium at 20%. And then the Americans are all outraged that Iran has, why are they increasing enrichments? And then the Americans and the Israelis, they assassinated the scientist who led that project to enrich uranium at 20%. They murdered him. In fact, the first nuclear scientist that was murdered, and sorry I'm rambling, and it's like 1 a.m. now, and so I may not be making much sense, but the first scientist that they assassinated, he was a colleague of mine at the University of Tehran, Dr. Mohammadi, and they murdered him in front of his wife as he was going to work in the morning. And all of these assassinations are joint projects, just like the aggression against Iran, just like the Holocaust in Gaza. These are all things that the Israelis can't do without the Americans. They're always in it together. There's no, separate sphere where the Israeli regime does its own thing. So the philosophy behind all this is that we have to be on our own feet. We have to produce our own capabilities. We have to have indigenous industry and infrastructure. And right now, anyone could look it up. Iran is a leading country in stem cell research and nanotechnology, in many high-tech fields. Iran, despite all the sanctions, it does pretty well. So obviously, nuclear energy would be a part of this. Now, someone may say, okay, all that's fine, and you're right, and Iran is fantastic, and you're the best, and so tell us, so why are you producing enriched uranium at 60%? That shows that it's all a lie and it's all a facade. And you're just making this stuff up, or whatever. I actually addressed this 3 years ago repeatedly when I was a media advisor to the nuclear negotiating team in Vienna, because I was asked repeatedly, okay, why are you producing nuclear fuel or enriched uranium at 60%? And I said, for leverage. The United States and the Europeans are strangling ordinary Iranians with maximum pressure sanctions. Do you think that the United States intends to stop strangling anyone? No. They're carrying out a genocide in Gaza. Why would they stop strangling Iranians? Cuba, like, what threat does Cuba pose to the United States? Have they stopped strangling it? Do they think if they loosen the stranglehold, communism will take over America or something from Havana? No, but they just like strangling. That's how they are. Whoever they don't like, just crush them, destroy them. People die. Who cares? Just you can use Al Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, and the media demonize Iran and make this a sectarian thing. And so many people, instead of seeing the reality, they see this fake narrative, and they believe that. In Latin America, they demonize Cuba as if like it's some sort of threat. The biggest threat that Cuba poses is that it exports positions across Latin America. That's the threat it poses to humanity. And they are trying to block that, and they have blocked that to a large extent, the Americans. But I digress. So that enriched uranium is for leverage. You have to have leverage at the negotiating table if you're going to force the Americans to stop killing people, to stop preventing Iran from importing medicine, importing food, making it more difficult to purchase the needs of ordinary people, making it more difficult for people to live a normal life in the country. So 60% has always been on the table. The Iranians have always been prepared to get rid of it in return for something else, and that is the removal of sanctions. It's very simple, very simple. They know it. Western media knows it. Western elites know it. But they lie to people, and they lie to themselves so much that they believe their own propaganda. I said this once before. We have this this person in Persian literary history or in Persian popular culture in the past called Mullah Nasruddin. And one of his stories is that he spread this rumor in town that they're like ash. It's sort of like similar to soup, but they're giving free soup at so-and-so place, whatever place in town. So then his friends who knew that he had been spreading the rumor go and see that they're walking by and they see him standing in queue or in line, as the Americans say. And they say, why are you here? And he says, for soup or for ash. And they say, but you spread the rumor. You know it's fake. He said, I know I spread the rumor. I know it's fake. But what if they are actually giving soup? So this is how the narrative works in the West. They repeat the lie so much that they actually these elites start believing their own lies.
Come see us on tour in Glasgow, Manchester, Belfast, Dublin, Liverpool, Birmingham, and London. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.